Hi, I'm Melissa Alexander, Director of Public Programs at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. Welcome to After Dark Online. For those of you who have joined us for After Dark at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, I just want to say we've missed seeing you so much. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time here online, we're so glad you're here with us tonight. Although our doors are still closed, we'll be bringing you After Dark online every Thursday night throughout the summer. While staff producing this program are sheltered in place across the San Francisco Bay Area, and some of the special guests are joining us from across the country, I want to acknowledge that the Exploratorium itself is on the traditional lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people and honor their caretaking of that land, both past and present. The Exploratorium's educational mission is to offer you tools to understand the world around you and enable your ability to cross-examine the systems within which you function. Right now, we're witnessing, and some of us are participating in, global protests and demonstrations against police brutality and anti-Black racism, even as we experience a global pandemic. Now, one outcome of this is that the Exploratorium is thinking deeply about representation and racism in our nation and our institutions. We are reckoning with our historic underrepresentation of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, their perspectives, history, art, and science within our exhibit halls and our staff. So that you are well served, we must now respond with representation, with accountability, and most of all, with learning. We know that in order to get through this pandemic, we must rely on science. We at the Exploratorium also believe that science can contribute to curing the disease of racism. But are there valid reasons some might not trust science as a cure for racism so much? What are these reasons, and how do we account for the ways that people, past and present, have used science in ways that have harmed our communities and created enduring consequences for all of us? How do these consequences affect our experience differently if we are Black, Brown, Indigenous, or white? This month's programs are intended to empower and support you on an exploration of some of these difficult questions as our society and you grapple with these dual pandemics. Each evening over the coming month, our outstanding special guests will be in conversation with my science and program colleagues from the Exploratorium. Thank you again for joining us at the Exploratorium's After Dark program online. And thank you especially for learning with us.
Hello, my name is Kathleen, and I'm part of the programming team at the Exploratorium. I'm pleased to be here with Udodiri Okwandu, who is a doctoral candidate in the History of Science Department and Presidential Scholar at Harvard University. She graduated cum laude from Harvard University in 2017 with an AB in the History of Science, Mind, Brain, and Behavior track, and a secondary in Global Health and Health Policy. Her senior thesis, which won the Thomas T. Hoops Prize, an award which recognizes outstanding scholarly work or research by students selected by a committee of faculty from Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, examined the medicalization and racialization of civil rights protests in the 1960s and 70s, contextualizing it with the rise of law and order political ideology, which is what she'll be sharing with you tonight. She is passionate about using her research to explore the rich and complex histories of Black Americans and other marginalized communities as they relate to medicine and science. She is particularly interested in the ways in which scientific and medical inquiry have been deployed by the state to manage and control marginalized populations. As such, her work critically examines science and medicine's relationship to power and their ability to enact subjection. Her current work examines the intersection and constructions of race, reproduction, and psychiatric health in the United States, and how they undermine the concept of citizenship for Black Americans. She'll be sharing with you now her talk, which is titled Violence in the Black Brain, Medicalizing Civil Rights Protest, 1960 through 1975.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Again, my name is Udodiri Okwandu, and today I'm going to be giving a talk titled Violence in the Black Brain, Medicalizing Civil Rights Protest, 1960 to 1975. And without further ado, I'm going to get started. Among the three stories gracing the cover of the February 1973 issue of Ebony, a monthly magazine geared towards Black Americans, was an article by B.J. Mason titled New Threat to Blacks, Brain Surgery to Control Behavior. The title itself, both alarming and commanding, raises several critical questions. Why does Mason identify brain surgery as a threat that Black people specifically should be concerned about? What specific behaviors does brain surgery aim to control? And why are these behaviors conceptualized as uniquely Black? Mason's article provides answers to these questions and more. The new threat to Blacks that Mason identifies is psychosurgery, a treatment that involves the removal of brain tissue to modify, control, and treat pathological behavior. In this context, pathological behavior encompassed senseless violence and characteristics and behaviors such as aggressiveness, destructiveness, rage, and stealing. However, Mason is not suggesting that these forms of violence are unique to Black Americans. Instead, he argues that constructions of senseless violence are historically and sociopolitically contingent and highly racialized. To substantiate his critique and concern, Mason identifies the research of Boston-based neurosurgeons Vernon Mark and William Sweet and psychiatrist Frank Ervin. Through public remarks and publications, the doctors argued that urban riots in Black communities were the result of neurological dysfunction. Additionally, they advocated for the use of psychosurgery to treat and prevent this form of senseless violence. However, the doctors' attention towards the biology of violence was not novel. Throughout their careers, they argued that while controlled aggression may be necessary for species survival, unprovoked and uncontrolled violence was not. Instead, they considered it unnatural, pathological, and indicative of the presence of structural brain damage. For the doctors, the difference between controlled and pathological violence was crucial. They argued that controlled violence could be modified through learning and social and moral controls. Conversely, they argued that pathological violence was not modifiable because it was caused by structural damage to the brain. In these cases, environmental interventions would be ineffective. They argued that the only way to fix pathological violence was through psychosurgical techniques. Prior to the mid-1960s, the doctors explored the differences between controlled and pathological violence by studying patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, who exhibited violent behavior when experiencing seizures. They discovered that their violence was caused by epileptic discharges emanating from the patient's diseased amygdalas. This led them to conclude that there was a relationship between abnormalities in the limbic system and violent behavior. However, by the mid-1960s, Mark Ervin and Sweet began to turn their attention towards individuals who did not have epilepsy. In other words, they began to speculate that the brain disease that produced violence could occur in patients that did not have epilepsy. This shift is what allowed the doctors to turn their attention towards the violent behavior of Black protesters. Defending this assertion, Dr. Sweet stated, "We're talking about senseless violence. Senseless violence is more likely to be associated with organic brain disease than violence with an ascertainable motive. The individuals who have this ultra-low threshold to violent assault and behavior would be utterly wanton and bring discredit on their movement by excesses of one sort or another." Dr. Mark reinforced this point by adding, "What we were looking at were people who behaved inappropriately in a riot." Both Dr. Sweet and Mark's statements demonstrate an attempt to legitimize the shift in their work by making a distinction between meaningful and meaningless violence. However, what factors enabled this shift in the first place? In other words, how did urban rioting come to be understood as senseless by Mark Irvin and Sweet? As found in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, senseless is defined as lacking common sense, wildly foolish, and most notably, of violent or wasteful action without discernible meaning or purpose. Thus, the doctors claim that Black urban rioting and violence that took place during the civil rights movement was caused by neurological dysfunction suggests that during this time period, rioting was not conceived as a legitimate method of protest. Instead, it was viewed as an unnecessary act. This raises two critical questions. First, why would urban violence and rioting in African American communities become a concern for scientists at this particular historical moment? And secondly, how did the social and political context during this period influence the reception and perceived credibility of Doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet's claims? The remainder of this presentation will dive into these questions by demonstrating that Doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet's scientific inquiry cannot be divorced from the popularization of law and order political ideology, which criminalized more active Black equality strategies. This resulted in what I call the recategorization of Black American protest methods as senseless violence. I argue that Mark Irvin and Sweet were able to assert that urban rioting in Black communities was a form of pathological violence because it was classified as senseless and unprovoked in the political and public spheres. This allowed the doctors' work to be conceived and later affirmed and appropriated by political bodies. As such, a central concern of today's talk is highlighting the ways in which scientific and medical ideas can be oppressive and ultimately reinforce systems and practices of power that uphold white supremacy and anti-Black racism. Rather than serving as a legitimate and justified response to sustained inequality, oppression, and white supremacy, Mark Irvin and Sweet's research made it possible for Black protesters' behaviors to simply be attributed to having defective brains. In other words, Mark Irvin and Sweet's work legitimized a larger societal consensus that Black American urban violence and rioting was simply senseless. Ultimately, the research aided in upholding oppressive systems that reinforced the depoliticization of Black protest. It is impossible to divorce the manifestation of Mark Irvin and Sweet's claims from the sociopolitical context in which they arose, a period that witnessed a pronounced shift in attitudes toward the civil rights movement and African American protest. Beginning in the mid-1960s, Black protest was increasingly viewed as senseless in the political and public spheres. Turning our attention towards law and order ideology and examining changes in civil rights protest methods allows us to see how this shift took place and, as I have suggested, enabled the doctors to make their claims in the first place. Appeals for law and order as a political strategy call for stricter and more punitive measures against crime. However, it is critical to note that conceptions of criminality are entirely contingent upon the sociopolitical context in which they are embedded and are structured by prevailing racial attitudes. Changes in Black protest methods, particularly the onset of rioting, became associated with a breakdown in law and order in the public and political domains. Prior to the onset of mass racial rioting in the mid-1960s, historians largely agree that a majority of civil rights tactics were, quote unquote, nonviolent. Rooted in civil disobedience, activists attempted to produce crisis situations in order to enable dialogue between governmental bodies and activists. These efforts were successful throughout the 1950s and early 1960s in that they contributed to the introduction of legislation and judicial rulings that aimed to promote racial equality, such as Brown v. Board education and the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1964, which desegregated public schools and served as voting rights bills and anti-racial discrimination bills, respectively. However, despite these steps towards racial progress, dissenting voices within the civil rights movement emerged. They argued that it was impossible for Black people to truly achieve equality in America. The irony that Black Americans became more critical of political and social institutions during a period of progress can be described by the theory of relative deprivation, which occurs when individuals of a particular group compare their position to others and realize that they have less than they are entitled. Scholars have argued that relative deprivation contributes to both social movements and political violence, such as rioting. In response to these conditions, the Black Power movement's protest methods emerged as a powerful departure from previous approaches to civil rights activism. The Black Power movement was not so much about equality as independence, and as such was rooted in seizing power rather than seeking compromise. As such, direct action against the white American establishment resulted in more direct confrontations by Black Americans in the form of rioting in urban areas. These sentiments were particularly evident in the summer of 1967, now called the Long Hot Summer, which witnessed 159 race riots across America in cities such as Atlanta, Boston, New York, and Newark. These riots erupted in response to the frustrations of poverty, the systematic denial of employment opportunities by white-owned businesses, and mistreatment and excessive force by police. However, it is critical to note that African-American rioting was not simply nonsensical. Scholars such as James N. Upton have noted that those who choose to engage in riots must perceive the government as illegitimate, immutable, but within their power to change. Rioting, far from being a form of senseless behavior, is often an action that is pursued in the absence of alternate forms to express grievances, or when political bodies fail to act swiftly and concretely in the face of oppression. However, this shift in African-American protest was accompanied by an increased sense of apprehension and fear among white Americans toward African-American collective action. For example, political scientists Joel D. Averback and Jack L. Walter examined Black and white attitudes towards the 1960s riots. They found that the concepts of Black power and Black consciousness elicited varying reactions among white and Black Americans. While for Black Americans, the term symbolized tactical issues regarding forms of protest and racial struggle, white Americans were more likely to associate the terms with Black domination or contemporary unrest, which he, the white American, cannot understand or tolerate. In fact, 80.7% of whites surveyed viewed Black power unfavorably. These sentiments were prevalent in political and public discourses regarding the problem of urban violence and rioting. During the 1964 presidential election, Republican nominee Barry Goldwater, who was highly critical of both civil disobedience and riots, popularized and elevated appeals for law and order within the public sphere. His opponent, Democratic incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson, was also concerned with urban rioting. He believed that his social programs would reduce their manifestation. However, these initiatives emerged at the height of the civil rights era and were rooted in critical responses to Black communities' role in urban disorder, which led to a simultaneous war on crime. Johnson won the 1964 election, and law and order ideology persisted throughout his presidency in the public and political domain. In examining the congressional record and news media, I found that these discourses, regardless of party affiliation, characterized Black rioting as senseless by relying on three rhetorical tools. The first was to describe these methods as antithetical to American values. Consequently, Black rioting and protest was characterized as compromising a society based on order. A second was to emphasize the ways in which white Americans were victimized by Black protest methods. For example, politicians characterized institutionalized racism as an alleged injustice committed by whites against Blacks. The use of the word alleged diminishes white culpability in contributing to racial inequality in America. And lastly, powerful rhetoric served to criminalize Black protesters by describing them as hoodlums, extremists, or threats. As examined, urban rioting was categorized as senseless and criminal amidst the rise of law and order political ideology in the public and political spheres. It is in this context that doctors Mark, Irvin, and Sweet were able to apply their biomedical model of violence to the phenomena of urban rioting. If their early research focused on senseless and unprovoked violence, and rioting came under this purview, then, by their logic, Black rioting fits squarely within their research ambitions. Their attempt to use biomedicine to treat urban rioting fits squarely within a broader trend in post-war American society that viewed science and medicine as a means to fashion a specific type of world. In fact, by the mid-1960s, the notion that American society was becoming medicalized was extremely prevalent. Expanding definitions of health led deviant social and cultural conditions to be understood as illnesses, an expansion that is arguably more reflective of political achievements and the enforcement of social control rather than legitimate scientific inquiry. Mark Irvin and Sweet's speculation on the biological roots of urban rioting and violence fits squarely within this tradition. In this world, the imagination of what could be changed, fixed, or altered through science and medicine was unlimited. Examining two key publications pictured on these slides, The Role of Brain Disease in Riots and Urban Violence, published in 1967, and Violence in the Brain, published in 1970, demonstrate how law and order political ideology made it possible for the doctors to conceptualize Black rioting as senseless violence and use biomedicine as a means to manage and control a perceived problem that plagued society. In both the article and the book, the doctors discuss African American rioting in relation to violent behavior such as murder, physical assault, or arson. To substantiate their claims, they highlight studies that examine the relationship between abnormal brainwaves and homicidal behavior without a clear motive. In examining these studies, Mark and Irvin and Sweet reinforced the idea that urban rioting and violence was done senselessly, a notion that persisted as a consequence of law and order ideology. As described by scholar Michael Flam, what ultimately gave law and order such potency then was precisely its amorphous quality, its ability to represent different concerns to different people at different moments. Similarly, the doctors evoked this amorphous quality by conceptualizing various behaviors and public concerns that were considered violent within the same biological explanatory model. In doing so, both the article and the book reinforced law and order politics' association of urban rioting with criminality. Additionally, the authors undermine the impact of environment in favor of the dominance of biology in explaining violence. While they acknowledge that factors such as poverty, unemployment, slum housing, and inadequate education underlie the nation's urban riots, they go on to assert that only focusing on these issues neglects the potential role of biology. They claimed that, in stressing the role of the brain, they were not denying the importance of social behavior. However, they go on to reinforce their claim by asserting that even environmental influences were inherently biological. That is because, they argued, all influences and events are stored in and translated into behaviors solely by the brain. By putting forth this argument, the doctors promoted a biological deterministic understanding of violence that divorced its manifestation from social and political and economic considerations. Lastly, both publications undermine social approaches to addressing violence in the past and present. The doctors believe that focusing on social interventions overlooked newer medical evidence and the personal aspects of violent behavior, and resulted in the loss of millions of dollars worth of governmental aid. In doing so, the doctors reinforce law and order proponents' argument that social conditions did not justify nor cause riots. As early as 1968, the doctors began to draft a series of proposals to explore the neurological roots of violence. For the doctors, it was not simply about theorizing about the relationship between the brain and violence, but about producing tangible interventions that would affect people's lived realities. Mark Irvin and Sweet envisioned a future that utilized diagnostic measures for the prevention of violence and utilized psychosurgery as a treatment. Early drafts of their proposals sought to identify a relationship between limbic system disease and violent behavior in those who did and did not exhibit temporal lobe epilepsy. In other words, individuals such as urban rioters who were viewed as violent but did not have epilepsy could be eligible for psychosurgery. However, by the 1970s, final drafts of their proposals in response to various evaluators identified only epileptics, both violent and nonviolent, as the individuals that could benefit from psychosurgery. My examination demonstrates that the doctors were likely pressured to confine their research to epileptics due to concerns, which reached their peak in the early 1970s, that their work would be used as a tool by governmental bodies to control and suppress Black American political dissent. In 1971, Peter Breggin, who is a psychiatrist, discovered attempts by a large number of surgeons to commence a resurgence of psychosurgery across the nation, and Breggin is pictured on the left. Breggin quickly aided in shedding light on both the political and racial implications of research on the biology of social forms of violence, such as urban rioting. After several failed attempts to make his discoveries known to the public, his article, The Return of the Lobotomy and Psychosurgery, was published in the Congressional Record in 1972 by Congressman Cornelius E. Gallagher, who's pictured on the right. In the article, Breggin argues that psychosurgery had the potential to be used as a form of social control in order to eliminate non-psychiatric behaviors that were deemed atypical or that threatened the status quo. He further illuminates the political nature of psychosurgery in his article, Psychosurgery for Political Purpose, providing evidence that psychosurgery was both racialized and tied to sociopolitical concerns. He also demonstrates that doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet took advantage of anxieties following racial disorder in urban centers to promote their research. By the beginning of 1973, fears that psychosurgery would be used as a tool to suppress African American protests and activism proliferated within the Black community. For example, B.J. Mason's Ebony article, New Threat to Blacks, Brain Surgery to Control Behavior, which I discussed at the start of this talk, widely circulated within the Black community. As noted by Mason and pictured on the slide, he asserted, persons more in tune with the indignities suffered by Blacks would argue that there is no such thing as senseless violence, that individuals who commit brutal acts in a riot always have reasons, whether whites consider them apparent and valid or not. What is described as senseless is, in reality, that which white society cannot accept. Additionally, he noted that Dr. Mark Irvin and Sweet's work obscured the fact that it was ghetto conditions, not ghetto residents, that were abnormal. African American physicians also spoke out against Mark Irvin and Sweet's work. For example, Dr. Alvin Pissant, then associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, asserted the following: their studies are racist. It assumes that Black people are genetically damaged, that they're so animal and so savage that whites have to carve on their brains to make them into human beings. When all these institutes around the country decide to study violence, who do they go look at? The Black man. But who's committing all the violence? The white man, white society, white policemen. They don't consider that something's wrong with their brains. Within the political sphere, the Congressional Black Caucus began drafting legislation that would ban psychosurgery. This bill was eventually introduced on March 7, 1973, by Representative Louis Stokes. In his remarks addressing the House, Stokes described psychosurgery as a frightening, repugnant, and an immoral medical development. Stokes also expressed disdain towards doctors such as Mark Irvin and Sweet that exaggerated the efficacy of the operation, as well as neglected the role of social factors that contributed to crime and violence. More specifically, Stokes addressed the government's involvement in violence research that specifically targeted poor, disadvantaged minorities. Critics of Mark Irvin and Sweet's work also used the doctor's own public remarks to demonstrate the political nature of their work. For example, William Sweet publicly revealed that Elliot Richardson, then Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, told him that the doctors would receive more governmental funding if they linked their work to the political fears of the time, specifically Black American rioting. Ultimately, the Law Enforcement and Assistance Administration, in conjunction with the National Institutes of Mental Health, awarded the doctors nearly $600,000, revealing the effectiveness of appealing to larger political and social concerns. The political nature of their work is further revealed through remarks made by Irvin, in which he states that they purposely framed their work within the volatile sociopolitical climate in order to garner federal funding. He stated that the basis of their work was not to make a human argument, with the goal of helping the targeted population be nicer to people. Rather, he asserted, we're, Mark Irvin and Sweet, really talking about being socially cost effective. If you can work out a way to define, diagnose, treat, and even prevent a problem, you're going to save a lot of money. In response to these mounting concerns, the committee responsible for evaluating the research proposals decided they would approve their research only if they restricted their subjects to and the use of psychosurgery on individuals with epilepsy. An emphasis on epileptic patients can be read as an explicit rejection of the potential political abuses of this procedure. The archive clearly demonstrates that the committee was concerned that psychosurgery could be used to suppress political dissent and represented an attempt at institutionalizing a safeguard against future abuse of their research. That the biomedicalization of urban rioting and violence in African American communities occurred just as the fight for Black equality became more assertive, unrelenting, and less concerned with protesting in ways deemed legitimate to mainstream white America was not a product of chance. As presented through my presentation, the investigation of psychosurgical means for the treatment and prevention of violence was deeply embedded in and influenced by the sociopolitical context in which it arose. As political bodies who desired a reestablishment of law and order in Black communities became interested in their research, it became increasingly clear that their work not only depoliticized civil rights protests, but also left room for the possibility of using psychosurgery as a tool for social control. As the lines between proactive protest and disruptive unrest became increasingly blurry within the public and political sphere, the doctors claimed that there was a relationship between neurological dysfunction and rioting further complicated debates on how to respond to rioting in African American communities. In light of the racial implications of Mark Irvin and Sweet's work, one would hope that future actors in the scientific and political spheres would learn from the mistakes of their predecessors. However, in the decades following their claims, Black violence continued and continues to be pathologized, despite the success of 1970s activism in halting politically and racially motivated scientific investigations. For example, political bodies attempted to approach the problem of violence through biomedical means in the 1990s, amidst increasing concerns of violent crime, economic stress, and urban unrest. In 1992, the federal government put forth their proposal for a violence initiative, which aimed to reduce violence and unrest in America's inner cities, but rested on the premise that violence was caused by biochemical and genetic defects and should be treated through the use of biopsychiatric drugs. Even in the last decade, we continue to see attempts to establish a relationship between race and violent behavior. For example, in their article, Do Pigmentation and the Melanocortin System Modulate Aggression and Sexuality in Humans as They Do in Other Animals, J. Felipe Rushton and Donald I. Templer argue that darker pigmented people average higher levels of aggression and sexual activity and also have lower IQs. They found that Black people were overrepresented in crime statistics relative to whites and Asians. However, the problem with relying on crime statistics is that they fail to take into account that Black people are disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and convicted and incarcerated as a consequence of a largely anti-Black criminal justice system. In the last month, protests and demonstrations have taken place across America in response to the unjust killings of Black Americans such as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and countless others. These protests are a call for the destruction of systems, institutions, and behaviors that uphold white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and inequality. Yet far too many are concerned with the destruction of property rather than the destruction of Black life, using the manifestation of rioting as a way to undermine and threaten violence against a movement that aims to ensure that equal protection is guaranteed for all. It does not matter that Doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet never operated on Black urban rioters during the 1960s. What matters is the fact that their theory perpetuated an association between Blackness and innate violence that continues to live on even today. Racial violence and unrest continues to be conceptualized as unique to Black and Brown communities, despite the fact that violent behavior can and does occur among all racial groups. Due to the prevalence of white privilege within a racialized American society, it is Black actions that are constructed as violent and abnormal. This occurs because Blackness is constructed as being alien to the cultural norm. Consequently, white violence has been historically ignored because white supremacy dictates which groups are or are not considered violent. Ultimately, this maintains racial divisions, reinforces racialized discourses on violence, and elevates non-whites to an inferior, culpable position. The case of Mark, Irvin, and Sweet demonstrates the dangers that can arise when politics, race, and science intersect. By biomedicalizing urban rioting in Black communities, the impact of sociopolitical and economic disenfranchisement in contributing to its manifestation is decontextualized. Rather than promoting equitable solutions, biomedicalizing violence risks erasing the narratives of those struggling and pleading for equality, and ultimately relies on scientific jargon to justify the institutionalized inequality that affects our most vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk and for agreeing to answer just a few questions. Something that's disappointing in this online space is not being able to have the audience ask you questions, because I'm sure there would be some really rich ones. However, I'll try to stand in for them. But first, can you just tell us about what brought you to the field of the history of science and some of your own background?
Yeah, of course. So I guess how I got into the history of science, I've always been in a very health-oriented family. There's a lot of nurses, we have a few doctors. So I grew up with a lot of people that are invested in medicine and science and processes of healing and health. And so I thought naturally, me too, I'm gonna become a doctor or a nurse and like enter the health field. Entered college, took a few pre-med classes, absolutely hated them. Science was not my jam at all. But I stumbled upon this course called Medical Ethics and History my sophomore year, and I felt like it was the perfect bridge between, thinking about medicine and science and its place in the world without actually having to do any of the science or biology that was expected from me in pre-med courses. And so I'm thinking about that, and also working as like a public health student, I realized that history was incredibly important and critical in understanding the health issues that we see within this world, particularly when it relates to disparities and injustice and inequality within our healthcare systems. And so I signed up to be a history of science major, and it was through that process and through those classes I was really able to see how medicine, which is often viewed as a neutral and a neutral discipline, is actually imbricated in systems of power, economics, and larger political considerations. And that in itself, that can make it a tool of oppression. And so in doing those types of studies, that's the types of questions I continue to become invested in, the types of questions I want to continue to investigate, because I think this knowledge is very critical and important to create a more equitable healthcare system and scientific disciplines within the world.
And it's interesting that you did start looking into medicine and the hard sciences, and then as you moved into this more humanities-rooted approach, you were able to see a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And in the research you just shared, a way that research seemed to have been protected was by having it stay in its medical silo, and to sort of I guess they said they don't ignore, but they felt that social factors were being over-prioritized from their medical vantage. So I'm curious, as you think about how these fields are often separate, how does that continue to support a lack of our ability to understand complete pictures and a way to protect racial injustices and biases within the sciences and medicine?
Yeah, I think, one of the main problems with, it's really easy for us to see how literature or politics or, the law is reflective of the society that we live in. I think it's easier. But with science and medicine, I think because it's often in the jargon or language that the normal person can't understand, it's automatically viewed as something that's neutral. But something that we talk about a lot in the history of science is the fact that there is no such thing as an objective scientific fact. And the reason why they say that is because the investigators who are engaging in medical or scientific discourses are people that live in social worlds that are impacted by political considerations, this cultural values that they live in, social norms, and et cetera. I mean, we see that a lot when we talk about the science of gender and sex. People are obsessed with this idea that those are neutral categories, and they're not. That the only reason why those categories exist is because it's reflective of, the dominant cultural norms that we see. The same thing is embedded within multiple types of scientific inquiry, as we saw within this talk. They're able to label Black writing as senseless within this framework of, senseless violence that stemmed from, research on epileptic patients, because they didn't see the value or reason or rationale behind Black writing. And so I think that's one of the biggest dangers that happens with medicine and science when it's so siloed, when people are, pretending to operate within these objective scientific facts without really, sitting critically and thinking about the ways in which, the textbook they're reading or the scientific ideas that they're reading are reflective of these larger issues. So I definitely think I'm a huge advocate for bridging the humanities and the biological sciences. I think once we're able to do that and people are able to recognize our past and our history, they're able to change the types of questions they ask and the nature of the research that they pursue to ensure that it's more equitable and isn't riddled with, racial, gender, all types of biases that exist within this world.
And something you were alluding to too is that they use the word senseless as a way of legitimizing the research, and that they as scientists or medical practitioners could then make sense. So I'm interested, you also showed the slide of how violence and protests were viewed throughout the civil rights era and certain terms that were used. How are you seeing that type of rhetoric continue to show up in current conversations around protests against police brutality, as well as in support of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, that's a big one. I'm actually going to take it back to mid 2015 when I first started thinking about this project. There's been so many countless unnecessary deaths of Black Americans at the hand of police force. But I remember during that time, there was a lot of movement and activism. And when I was watching the news and, even overhearing conversations from classmates, there's always this, desire to call the people who are engaging in riots or even simply just protesting, calling them crazy or out of their minds or insane. And I was just very disturbed by that because for me, the rationale behind protesting and, asserting demands was so obvious because we do live in an unequal society. And so I immediately started thinking, did this happen in the 1960s? The moment feels so familiar. And lo and behold, this is how I actually stumbled on this project. By asking that initial question, did something like this happen again? When we're looking at it now, we're seeing again the same types of discourses. I mean, we're seeing our own, governments and president, threaten violence against protesters who are simply trying to, assert, equality for all, threatening the military to, suppress what's being perceived as, an irrational or unnecessary or senseless action. There's larger considerations for the destruction of property and, retail stores like Target than there are for, the fact that there's been a sustained, onslaught on these communities for hundreds of years. And so it is repeating itself. It's not, obviously the context and the circumstances are not exactly the same, but the discourses around undermining a movement by, having a focal vision on what's being perceived as, violence or rioting without understanding why people engage in rioting in the first place is very harmful. And it serves to just undermine the larger picture of what these movements are trying to achieve. And so what I hope with presentations like this is that people are able to see, one, this isn't new. This is a pattern that is consistently used to undermine these movements and undermine Black people and pathologize them. But also, hopefully can leave room to, for people to think more critically about how they're discussing these discourses and take these demands and demonstrations more seriously.
And Another piece in addition to science having this platform of neutrality that gives it legitimacy is institutions as well. So you did share that there was some pushback against this research, but could you talk more about how it was legitimatized, at least for a certain period of time, and sort of the larger institutions that allowed and supported this research?
Yeah. So I guess something I always like to clarify is that, and I say at the end, is like, thankfully no one was ever operated on. But for me, that's like besides the point when it comes to this project. It's the fact that, circumstances allowed them to get to the point where they're having meetings with, high up government chairs and are receiving funding from, governmental bodies in the form of close to $1 million. And so the proposals that I referred to at the end of the talk, they were attempting to establish these violent research centers in the Boston area. And they were trying to get funding from Harvard Medical School. And so in order for their proposal to be approved, it went through a long series of like bureaucratic and scientific review boards, essentially. And so I kind of condensed it during the talk because it's kind of a lot to go into. But basically, in examining those letters, you're seeing this back and forth between the actors, Doctors Mark, Irvin, and Sweet that I'm discussing, and the people on the committee who are, high up chairs at Harvard Medical School, but are also receiving pushback from students who are getting awareness of their work. For my examination, I honestly don't think their work would have been stopped unless there had been if there hadn't been widespread activism during this period against the medical establishment. So, during this period, we're also seeing the LGBTQ movement going on the rise, the women's movement is rising, and we also have the Black Power and Civil Rights movement. And so during this period, there's a lot of huge critiques against the medical establishment because they were extending their, domain on so many different areas of everyday life. And so that was a term I used, medicalizing, making everyday issues diseases. And so I think that for me, that, at least from what I observed, that's the only reason why they were able to be stopped, because the committee members were very concerned about what it would look like optically if they allowed a proposal like this to be passed in the midst of such widespread activism against the medical establishment. And so on that end, that's the reason why their work was confined to just examining people that had, proven structural brain damage. However, that didn't stop them on the federal level. Where they're able to get funding from the law enforcement agency, which is a part of the Justice Department, and the National Institutes of Mental Health. And they weren't the only project during this time that was being funded by the government. There was multiple different projects that were taking place in prisons and at other institutions. There was a case in Detroit, and there was another case at UCLA where people were trying to attempt to set up violence research centers, and were also trying to operate on prisoners. Oftentimes, these people were Black and brown. And so there's this clear disconnect between almost the medical community and their power to stop things and the larger federal government and their ability to continue to support and perpetuate this type of research. And so, yeah, that was long-winded, but that is to say that, the medical establishment, at least, they were stopped by this committee from funding their work. But the federal government obviously still had its larger investments, during this period. Also the war and crime was happening. And so they were still able to receive funding for their work.
Well, unfortunately, we're needing to wrap up, but before we do, is there anything unsaid that you want to share?
Not that I can think of. I just, thank you everyone for tuning in. And I hope that, this presentation, allows you to have, a little bit more context for what's going on today. And allows individuals to focus on the issues at hand, which is promoting equality for all citizens and all people in this country, rather than looking at the distractions. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.